They said the cowboy hadn't stepped beyond his land in 6 years, not since the night the snow took everything from him. And if Clara Whitmore had known that before pounding on his door with frozen fists and fading breath, she might have chosen death in the storm instead. But the wind howled like something alive across the plains that night, swallowing tracks and reason alike. And by the time she saw the dim glow of a lantern flickering through the whiteout, she was no longer thinking about whose land she trespassed on, only that she had to reach it or she would not see another sunrise. Her boots dragging through knee-deep drifts, her coat stiff with ice, each breath cutting like broken glass in her lungs, until at last she stumbled onto the wooden porch and collapsed against the door, summoning what little strength remained to raise her hand and knock. Once, then again, weaker, until the sound was nearly lost beneath the roar of the storm. And inside, Elijah Boone sat motionless, in his chair by the fire, the untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him as it had so many nights before, his world confined to the 4 walls of the cabin and the land that stretched beyond it. Land he had not left in 6 long years, not since the blizzard that had carved regret into his bones and taught him that some journeys cost more than they save. His dark eyes fixed on the flames as if they held answers he no longer believed in, until the faint, uneven knocking reached him, so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind itself. And for a moment he did nothing, because strangers meant questions and questions meant memories, and memories were the one thing he had learned to outrun by standing still. But the knocking came again, desperate this time, and something old and stubborn stirred in his chest, something he had buried alongside everything else. And with a low breath he rose, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps, his hand hovering at the latch before he pulled the door open against the screaming wind. And there she was, crumpled at his threshold like something the storm had discarded, her hair crusted with frost, her lips pale, her body trembling so violently it seemed it might break apart. And before he could think better of it, he was already moving, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all, though the way she flinched even in her half-conscious state did not go unnoticed, her fingers clutching weakly at his coat as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. And he carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him as the storm raged on outside, sealing them together in a way neither of them understood yet, laying her carefully near the fire as he worked quickly, methodically, stripping away her frozen gloves, wrapping her in thick blankets, pouring a measure of whiskey between her lips despite her faint protest, his movements practiced but distant, like a man who had once known how to care and had not quite forgotten the motions, even if the meaning behind them had faded. And when her eyes finally opened, clouded with exhaustion and confusion, they met his across the firelight, and for a long moment neither spoke, because words felt too fragile for a night like this. And when she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely more than a breath, "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone lived here." Elijah simply nodded, as if that was answer enough, his gaze already shifting away, retreating to the safety of silence he knew so well. But Clara was not the kind to let silence win, not even when it would have been easier. And as the hours dragged on and the storm showed no sign of easing, she began to speak in fragments, about the journey she had set out on, about the aunt she hoped to reach beyond Silver Creek, about the wrong turn that had led her into the storm, her words uneven but determined, as if talking itself kept her anchored to the world. And Elijah listened despite himself, saying little, offering only short replies when necessary, yet never once telling her to stop. And when she asked how far the nearest town was, he hesitated just long enough to reveal that the answer mattered more than he wanted it to. "Far enough in this weather," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. And she studied him then, really studied him, taking in the worn lines of his face, the quiet weight in his posture, the way the cabin seemed both lived in and abandoned all at once, as though time had stopped moving within its walls. And though she did not yet know his story, she could feel its presence in everything around her, in the untouched second chair by the table, in the dust that gathered on objects too carefully preserved to be forgotten. And something in her expression softened, not with fear as others might have shown, but with a kind of understanding that unsettled him more than suspicion ever could. And outside the storm continued its relentless assault, burying the world beyond the cabin under layers of ice and silence, ensuring that for now there would be no leaving, No. Escaping the strange twist of fate that had brought a lost woman to the door of a man who had long since stopped opening it. And as the fire burned lower and the night stretched on, Elijah found himself sitting awake long after Clara had fallen into an uneasy sleep, his eyes fixed not on the flames this time, but on the figure resting beneath his blankets. And for the first time in years, the quiet inside the cabin did not feel quite as empty, though he could not yet decide if that was a good thing or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Morning came slowly, the storm still clawing at the cabin walls as if unwilling to release what it had trapped, and Clara woke to the steady rhythm of wind and the unfamiliar weight of warmth that did not belong to her own strength, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the fire as she pushed herself up with a wince, her body reminding her of every mile she had fought through the night before. And across the room Elijah Boone stood near the window, his broad frame still as stone as he watched the white world beyond, as though expecting it to change if he stared long enough. Though when he noticed she was awake, he turned only slightly, offering a brief nod instead of greeting, his silence not unkind but heavy, like a habit too old to break. And Clara, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, studied him with quiet curiosity before forcing a small smile. "I suppose I owe you my life," she said, her voice steadier now though still soft from exhaustion, and Elijah shifted his gaze away, as if the weight of such words made him uncomfortable. "Storm would have taken anyone out there," he replied simply, moving to the table where a tin cup waited, sliding it toward her with a gesture that passed for hospitality in a place like this. And though his tone was distant, his actions told a different story, one of care he refused to name, and Clara accepted the cup, her fingers brushing the warmth as she let out a slow breath, the heat spreading through her like something she had not realized she needed so badly. And for a time they existed in that fragile quiet again, but unlike the night before, it no longer felt like something suffocating, more like something waiting, and Clara, never one to leave questions unasked, let her eyes wander around the cabin once more, lingering this time on details she had been too weary to notice before, the shelf lined with books untouched by dust except for one corner, the chair that faced the fire yet bore no signs of recent use, and most of all the violin resting on a small table near the wall, its surface worn but carefully maintained, as though it belonged to a life paused rather than ended. And she rose slowly, ignoring the protest of her legs as she crossed the room, her fingers hovering just above the instrument before she glanced back at Elijah. "Do you mind?" she asked, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, quick and guarded, but he gave a short shake of his head, and that was all the permission she needed, lifting the violin with surprising familiarity as she adjusted it beneath her chin, the first note soft and uncertain, like a question carried on air, but then another followed, and another, until the cabin filled with a melody that seemed too alive for a place that had forgotten what life sounded like, and Elijah stood frozen where he was, the sound striking something deep and buried within him, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, his jaw tightening as memories pushed against the walls he had built so carefully, the echo of another time, another voice, another night filled with music that had ended in silence he never escaped. And yet he did not stop her, could not stop her, even as the past threatened to drag him under. And when Clara finally lowered the bow, the last note lingering like a breath held too long, she looked at him, searching not for approval but understanding, and what she found unsettled her more than anger would have. Because behind his stillness was something broken, something unfinished. "You haven't played in a long time," she said gently, though it was less a question than a truth she could see, and Elijah exhaled slowly, the sound rough as gravel. "Wasn't mine," he answered, his voice quieter than before, and that was all he offered. But it was enough to tell her that the story behind those words was not one easily spoken, and she nodded, setting the violin back with care, respecting the boundary even, as she sensed its edges beginning to shift, and outside the storm began to ease, the wind losing some of its fury though the land remained buried beneath snow too deep to cross, trapping them together still. But the silence between them had changed, no longer empty, but filled with something fragile and growing. And it was not long before that fragile peace was tested, because just past midday the distant sound of hooves broke through the quiet, sharp and unmistakable, and Elijah's head snapped toward the door, his entire posture changing in an instant, as if the man she had seen until now had been only a shadow of something far more dangerous. His hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip as he stepped onto the porch without a word, the cold air rushing in behind him, and Clara followed to the doorway despite the chill, her heart quickening as she saw 3 riders emerging through the thinning storm, their silhouettes cutting through the white like something unwelcome and certain. And when they reached the edge of the property, they did not slow, did not hesitate, and Elijah's voice carried across the distance, low and firm. "That's far enough," he called, the authority in it undeniable. But the men only exchanged glances before pressing forward another few steps, their intentions written plainly in the way their hands rested near their guns. And Clara felt the shift in the air, the fragile safety of the cabin giving way to something tense and dangerous. And when one of the riders finally spoke, his tone smooth but edged with threat, "Heard. This land might be up for negotiation," he said, his gaze flicking briefly toward Clara before returning to Elijah. And something cold settled in Elijah's expression, something that told her this was not the first time men like these had come calling. And though he had not stepped beyond his land in 6 years, it was clear now that the world had not forgotten him, and it was not about to leave him in peace. And as the wind carried the last remnants of the storm across the frozen ground, Clara realized that whatever had brought these men here was far from over, and that Elijah Boone's past was no longer content to stay buried. They should have waited until the storm fully passed, until the roads cleared and the danger settled into something predictable. But men like that never waited. And as the wind died into a bitter hush over the snow-covered land, the 3 riders pressed closer, their horses snorting in the cold as they crossed a line Elijah Boone had not allowed anyone to cross in 6 years, his stance unmoving on the porch, his hand resting near his gun though not yet drawn, his voice carrying with quiet authority, "I told you that's far enough." And this time there was no mistaking the warning beneath it. But the man in front only smiled, the kind of smile that came from believing the outcome was already decided. "Railroads coming through," he said, glancing around as if the land already belonged to him. "This stretch here's worth more than you think, and we're here to make sure you understand that." And Clara felt the tension coil tighter in her chest as she stood just behind the doorway, watching the exchange unfold, the air thick with something far heavier than words. And Elijah didn't move, didn't rise to the bait. But there was a shift in him now, something steady and unyielding. "Not for sale," he replied simply. And for a moment the silence stretched, sharp and brittle, before one of the other men let out a short laugh, his gaze sliding toward Clara in a way that made her stomach turn. "Shame," he muttered. "Looks like you've got something worth protecting now." And that was the moment everything changed, because whatever restraint Elijah had been holding onto snapped clean in two, his eyes darkening as he stepped forward off the porch, placing himself firmly between them and the cabin, between them and her, and his voice dropped lower, colder. "You don't get to bring her into this," he said, and the lead rider raised his hand slightly, feigning innocence though his smirk never faltered, just saying, "Man alone for 6 years suddenly got company, makes folks wonder what else might change." And Clara saw it then, the line drawn not just in the snow but in Elijah himself, the boundary he had lived behind for so long now tested not by memory, but by something real and immediate. And when the man's hand shifted just a little too close to his gun, the moment shattered, the sound of Elijah's revolver clearing leather faster than the eye could follow, the shot cracking through the cold air with a finality that left no room for doubt, the bullet striking the man's arm and knocking him sideways in the saddle as his weapon fell useless into the snow, his companions scrambling back as their bravado faltered, replaced by the sudden realization that the quiet rancher they had come to pressure was something far more dangerous than they had assumed. And Elijah didn't fire again, didn't need to. The message already delivered in the way he stood there unmoved, unshaken, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than he cared to admit. "Next one won't be a warning," he said, his voice steady despite the echo of the gunshots still hanging in the air. And the remaining riders hesitated only a second before turning their horses, dragging their wounded companion with them as they retreated the way they had come, their threats left unspoken but understood. And when they were gone, swallowed by the fading storm, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. and Clara realized her hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had just witnessed, and Elijah lowered his gun slowly, the tension in his shoulders lingering even as the danger passed. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, because words seemed too small for what had just happened, until Clara finally stepped forward onto the porch, her voice quiet but certain. "You crossed it," she said, and Elijah looked at her, confusion flickering across his features. "Crossed what?" he asked, though something in him already knew, and she nodded. "Toward the open stretch of land beyond the cabin, the line where the snow had been untouched for years except by him alone. Your boundary," she said softly. "You stepped past it." And his gaze followed hers, settling on the place where his boots had marked the snow beyond that invisible line. The place he had not set foot in since the night everything had been taken from him. And something shifted in his expression then. Not fear, not regret, but something quieter, something like realization. And he let out a slow breath, as if the weight he had carried for so long had loosened just enough to remind him it didn't have to stay. And Clara stepped down beside him, the cold biting at her cheeks as she looked out over the land that had both trapped and protected him. "You didn't lose anything this time," she said, her voice steady. "You stopped it." And Elijah's eyes moved back to her, searching her face as if trying to understand how she could say something so simple about something that felt so complicated. But there was no doubt in her expression, no fear either, only a quiet strength that mirrored something he had almost forgotten existed. And the silence between them settled again, but it was different now, no longer something to hide within, but something to stand inside together. And as the last of the storm clouds broke apart above them, letting pale sunlight spill across the snow-covered land, Clara drew a slow breath and spoke again, softer this time. "When the road's clear, I'll have to leave." And the words hung there between them, inevitable and unwelcome all at once. And Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, though he gave a small nod. Because of course she would. Because people like her didn't stay in places like this, not with men like him. And yet something in his chest resisted the thought more than it should have. And Clara watched him for a moment before turning her gaze back to the horizon. "But I think," she continued, "some things aren't meant to stay buried forever." And with that she took a step forward, past the place where his boundary had once held him, her boots pressing into the untouched snow beyond. And then she paused, glancing back over her shoulder, not asking, not demanding, simply waiting. And Elijah stood there, the wind brushing against him as the world stretched wide and open in front of him for the first time in 6 years, the past behind him, the unknown ahead. And for a long moment he didn't move, because stepping forward meant more than crossing a line. It meant letting go of everything that had kept him there. And then, slowly, he followed,